Dr. S Jaishankar is among the world's most prominent diplomats and foreign ministers. Over the last decade, he has argued that India needs to transform its foreign policy by junking outdated concepts, forging new partnerships, and taking risks on the global stage. We have break down 5 changes India's foreign minister hopes to make in order to transform his country's foreign policy. In his book, The India Way, Dr. Jaishankar lays out his view of India's place in the world and why its foreign policy needs to change. To begin with, we need to understand how the world is changing. Dr. Jaishankar believes that we now live in a bizarre world order. Over the last decade, the rise of nationalism across the world has made the countries more self-interested and less interested in cooperating with other countries. For example, the United Kingdom turned its back on the European Union, while the United States, under Donald Trump, began to give up its leadership role in the world. Globalization, which brought much of the world together through the easy movement of goods, services, and people across borders, has also been in retreat. According to Dr. Jaishankar, we're entering a selfish world. The single-minded pursuit of national interest will make our world look more like a bazaar, with more players, less rules, and greater volatility. In this new bizarre world order, India's foreign minister wants to make 5 changes in order to deal with greater uncertainty and volatility. Change 1. India needs a pragmatic foreign policy. According to Dr. Jaishankar, India's foreign policy in the past has often been dominated by an obsession with ideology. During the 1950s, India's foreign policy under Nehru was based on ideological goals like anti-colonialism. And because of this, Nehru's India worked with powers like China, which was an Asian anti-colonial power, despite the fact that Beijing posed a security threat to the country. That meant that India was underprepared for the 1962 war with China, which resulted in an Indian defeat. Dr. Jaishankar believes that India does best when it abandons ideology for a pragmatic foreign policy. India's defeat of Pakistan in the 1965 and 1971 wars and its 1998 nuclear tests occurred once India had abandoned Nehru's ideological foreign policy for a realist one. In a bizarre world order where countries are transactional and every nation is looking out for itself, India's foreign policy cannot afford to return to ideology. India must reach out in as many directions as possible and maximize its gains. This is not just about greater ambition, it is also about not living in yesterday. In this world of all against all, India's goal should be to move closer towards the strategic sweet spot. Bottom line, Dr. Jaishankar wants a pragmatic policy that will see India engage with every power and extract whatever benefits it can. That's part of what India has been doing during his tenure as foreign minister. This year, India will host the G20 and work closely with major Western countries like the United States, United Kingdom, and France. However, India will also host Russia and China for the Shanghai Cooperation Organization Summit. Change 2. India's Panipat mentality needs to go. Put simply, a Panipat mentality refers to India's defensive mindset when it comes to dealing with external threats. Numerous foreign armies were allowed to invade deep into Indian territory unchecked before winning battles on the fields of Panipat and seizing control of the country. To Dr. Jaishankar, India has a Panipat mentality, a defensive mindset that fails to see threats coming and fails to stop them in time. For example, India's inability to see the China threat in the 1950s led to defeat in the 1962 war. Similarly, India was caught by surprise when its main strategic ally, the Soviet Union, collapsed in the 1990s. The bizarre world order of the future will have numerous risks and greater volatility than in the past. And according to Dr. Jaishankar, India can no longer afford to play defense and wait for threats to materialize. As a rising power, India will have to go on the offensive and shape the world rather than simply be shaped by it. Change 3. Indian foreign policy needs to take risks. Aside from a defensive mindset, India's foreign policy has traditionally followed a low-risk, low-reward strategy. Dr. Jaishankar cites the example of the 1962 war, where India broke its policy of non-alignment to gain military support from the United States after China attacked Indian troops. However, once the crisis ended, it went back to non-alignment instead of building on this relationship. A risk-averse foreign policy has caused India to miss too many opportunities to improve its strategic position. China has been more decisive by contrast. During the 1950s, China relied on the Soviet Union to fund its national development before pivoting to the United States in the 1980s. Dr. Jaishankar argues that China's ability to take risks has brought it benefits on the global stage. For the last decade, India's top diplomat has tried to steer India in a similar position. For example, India risked China's wrath by helping build up the Quad. That risk allowed India to abandon non-alignment and build closer ties with Japan, America, and Australia, while also improving its position against China. Change 4. India needs to control narratives. Dr. Jaishankar believes that a rising power needs to control narratives and be more likable. As India's power grows, it will need to nurture a positive image that reassures existing powers about its intentions. India's efforts to export vaccines to foreign countries during the COVID-19 pandemic through the Vaccine Maitri program were an effort to build that image. During the debates over India's position on the Ukraine war, Dr. Jaishankar himself took over defending India's position. His viral speeches and defense of India's position reflects that influencing narratives about India will be a key focus of the country's foreign policy in the years to come. Change 5. India needs to get better at strategic deception. To explain what strategic deception means, it helps to look at how China has handled America over the last 40 years. For the last 4 decades, China has been able to build closer economic ties with America and benefit from American technology, trade, and investment. At the same time, China was building a military force that could threaten America's power in Asia. Despite this, it was able to reassure America that its intentions were peaceful. Of course, once China's power grew, it was able to drop the perception and openly challenge America for power. Jaishankar sees the Chinese as masters of strategic deception. India has, in contrast, struggled with this policy of managing contradictions. In the 1950s, it was difficult for India to speak of Asian brotherhood with China while preparing an effective border defense. With Pakistan, the nostalgia of a partitioned people has continuously competed with the reality of an obsessive adversary. In a bizarre world order, managing contradictory policies and the risks that come with it will become a necessity for India. With these 5 changes, Dr. Jaishankar hopes to transform India's foreign policy and prepare the country for a leading role in the new world order.